My guest at this time is John Stonestreet. He is president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. John is also a co-author of a piece that ran recently in the Christian Post about the tensions in Hong Kong. In the piece, Mr. Stonestreet and Roberto Rivera explain that the unrest there is not just over political efforts to give the communist Chinese government more power over the people of Hong Kong. They say what much of the reporting misses is how this is also a battle to preserve the Christian church in Hong Kong while the Chinese government tries to stamp it out. And John, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, it's an honor to be here. Thanks so much.
Well, we certainly covered the protests in Hong Kong, and obviously a lot of other outlets did as well. The main issue in front of the people, it seemed, was this extradition law, which would allow the Chinese government to extradite people from Hong Kong to mainland China. 1 to 2 million people poured into the streets on multiple nights to protest this, and ultimately the leader there, Carrie Lam, decided to pull and kill the legislation. At least she says that's what's happened. How did Christians there see this as a time to rise up? How did Christianity factor into this huge debate?
Well, Christianity and the tension between Christianity and the Chinese Communist government has been in tension there for a long time. And that's the backdrop. And many of the leaders of this protest were leaders in previous protests. For example, in 2014, and other times, where Chinese governments have kind of the Chinese government has been tempted to kind of reach their hands into the way Hong Kong governs itself. And Hong Kong, of course, is supposed to, have a level of independence there. And it's highly influenced by Christianity. Now, look, you don't have to look very far to know that the other backdrop of this not only is this kind of history of the Chinese wanting to kind of shorten that 50-year window, and gain control of Hong Kong, 30 years sooner, but also the crackdown that the Chinese government has had across Chinese property or Chinese province on religious liberty issues. So we have the, Muslim Uyghurs being put in concentration camps. We've got a certain kind of school of Buddhist thought followers of that are actually reports are that they have been utilized for forced organ harvesting, and of course the crackdown on the Christian population, which is huge there, and had really in the last 10 years enjoyed a relative level of, I don't want to say peace, but they had been left alone. Well, in the last 4 or 5 years, that has not been the case. And so I think the Christian influence of these Hong Kong protesters looking across to the mainland and saying, look, we know what their intentions are. And the intentions of the Chinese government, you have to have a little bit of a historical memory, but not a very long historical memory, because this sort of behavior happens over and over and over.
It most certainly does. We saw it, we've seen it ever since the Communist Revolution there in the late 1940s. That's nearly 70 years ago now. What you and Roberto also point out in the column, John, is the terms by which Hong Kong was handed over from the British to the Chinese in 1997. It wasn't just, okay, you're part of China and you have to do everything the Chinese say now. There were specific terms on the rights of the Hong Kong people, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And it was supposed to last for 50 years. And it was kind of dubbed, the principle that was kind of governing this whole handover was one country, two systems. So, yes, it's part of the Chinese government, but it runs on its own. And, of course, the economic prosperity, the religious freedom, the freedom of speech, the freedom of elections, all these things that are just directly opposed to the Chinese communist way of doing things. It's not a surprise that those things come into tension. But this kind of one country, two system process was supposed to last again. The agreement, when Hong Kong was turned back over from the British to China, it was supposed to last for 50 years. And so we're less than 20 years into this, and they've already begun, or right around 20 years into this, and they're already beginning to undermine the autonomy that was part of that original agreement in terms of the law and that sort of thing.
And as you point out in the column, there may be a very good reason, or at least a very real reason, why the Chinese government wants to expedite that schedule. You and Roberto point out that the Chinese government obviously does not want a lot of Christian evangelism happening in China, yet it is happening, and Hong Kong Christians are playing a huge part in that.
Oh, that's right. I mean, yeah, this is the thing that the Chinese government has learned is that you really can't control the spread of the gospel. You can try, but it's really, really hard to do. Of course, that's been the story of the church throughout history. When they're obedient, when we follow the Lord, is that, look, we obey God rather than man. And now you have you have a Chinese state where Xi Jinping is holding himself up in kind of Mao-like terms, basically cracking down on any acknowledgement of a higher authority other than the state and Xi Jinping himself. I mean, this is Mao-like stuff. And the Christian gospel runs completely counter to that. When the early Christians said, Jesus Christ is Lord, there was an implicit and Caesar is not. Well, when Hong Kong Christians say Jesus is Lord, there's an implicit and the Chinese Communist government, specifically Xi Jinping, is not. And that's stuff that, as the Chinese government is trying to crack down on kind of innovation and freedom and independence, this is a recipe for disaster. In fact, one of the things we talked about just this past week on another commentary is that this sort of crackdown in the mainland is leading to an increase in refugees from China. So, now we actually have seen the first wave, and my guess it's only going to become a bigger wave of Chinese Christians now fleeing mainland China and looking for refuge in the United States and other places. And so that brings up a whole new conversation for Christians in America, specifically for conservatives who, support this administration and so many good things that they've done in terms of life and religious liberty and so on. But when it comes to accepting persecuted religious minority as refugees, the number under the Trump administration has really bottomed out. So this is going to bring a new challenge to people of faith and how we stand for our brothers and sisters over there.
Are you surprised at how little attention the Chinese persecution gets, whether it's from our government or from our media?
Well, look, in one hand, the administration last week held the second ministerial, which is the second, gathering. It's the largest gathering on religious freedom. It's international. And both of these ministerials, both last year and this year, led to the formation of an institution dedicated to promote religious liberty around the world and to punish bad actors. So in one sense, the spotlight, this administration with the appointment of Governor Sam Brownback as the ambassador at large for international religious freedom, Mike Pompeo has given an enormous amount of attention to the issue of religious liberty. So there is a lot of attention being given. But we are also going to have to spend more time in kind of addressing these issues. And with China, it's difficult because, obviously they're a loose cannon. And the trade war has already escalated tensions with China. Now you add a different category of tension, and it just goes to a new level. So it needs to be done with care, certainly. But one of the quick, easy things that we could do is actually accept more refugees, and especially those that are under, seeking asylum because of religious persecution, especially Christian. And for the record, both the president and the vice president, Mike Pence, said that they were going to do that. That was part of the campaign promises in 2016, that we're going to care for these people. Well, they are doing things to promote religious liberty and to punish bad actors around the world. We can celebrate that, but we're probably going to have to not let the numbers get as low as they have of allowing refugees in. It's being conflated with the crisis on the southern border, but this isn't immigration. This is a different issue, and we need to take care of it differently.
We're talking with John Stonestreet. He's the president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. And, John, I want to close on a topic you mentioned before, and you articulated it very well as to why a vibrant Christian faith is such a threat to an autocratic government like the Chinese. We've seen it, obviously, in many other communist regimes around the world, North Korea presently, Cuba, Soviet Union, on and on and on. And it's not just Christians who are being persecuted, but the Muslims and the Buddhists as well. But turning it about 90 degrees here, what is it about Christianity and freedom, and not just religious freedom, that the two seem to go hand in hand so clearly?
Yeah, I mean, it does, doesn't it? I mean, that's the story of the world. And I think it's found in a couple things. First, even the atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said that the very idea of human dignity, that every single person, by virtue of being human, nothing else, not because they have certain talents or abilities or certain color of their skin or certain gender or anything like that. Every single person has inherent dignity from the moment of birth to the moment of natural death. And that is a Christian idea that now has infected the world, right? So now everyone talks about human dignity as if it's a thing, even though we disagree on what it is that we mean by that. So that's the first thing. And when you start with human dignity, then you realize, wait a minute, there's something more important than our government or our utopian vision or our, policies, that all these other things should serve the human person. The human person doesn't serve the state. And that is one of the reasons that Christianity goes along with freedom. And the other one is that we believe in the way that God created us, not only to give us dignity, but he gave us freedom, that ultimately our conscience answers to him. My mentor, Chuck Colson, said it very well in the Manhattan Declaration. We can ungrudgingly render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, but we can never render to Caesar what belongs to God. And the Bible, the Bible scripture, God claims our highest authority. And that was something that was recognized in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. We haven't always lived it out well, certainly. But that very idea spawns all kinds of other freedoms, like freedom of speech and freedom of association, the freedom to order our public lives, how we set up our businesses around, our deeply held beliefs, how we educate our kids. So you can really see how the belief, the unique Christian idea about who we are as humans spawns freedom of conscience, and how freedom of conscience really is the foundation for all the other freedoms we have too.
Critical for us to remember as we go forward here as the United States, and critical also as we watch what is happening with our brothers and sisters in Hong Kong and the dangers they face from mainland China. John, fascinating column, fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for having me on.
You bet. John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.